So if you're doing buy side tariffs, right? So if you're incurring tariffs as an importer, you need to make sure that you have the setup inside of JD Edwards that's accounting for your tariffs from your suppliers and your items when you're actually receiving those items.
Think tariffs are just a finance problem? Think again. How are tariff shifts reshaping sourcing, risk management, and executive strategy? Today, we're digging into how tariffs and how you handle them inside JD Edwards can make or break your profitability. Stick around because at the end of this episode, you'll have a playbook for navigating tariff complexity with more vision and control. Welcome back to Not Your Grandpa's JD Edwards, the podcast where we explore real world challenges and forward looking solutions for JD users. I'm Nate Bushfield, and today's episode is all about a hot topic that impacts nearly every product based business: tariffs. With global trade volatility, nearshoring trends, and compliance demands on the rise, understanding how to handle tariffs in JD Edwards isn't just operational, it's strategic. Joining us is Mo Shujaat, VP for Application Advisory at ERP Suites. Mo's worked with manufacturers and distributors navigating these challenges daily. Mo, how are you doing today? And can you explain a little bit about your role?
Yeah, no, I'm doing pretty well. And so I lead our consulting practice here at ERP Suites. So that means that I work with our customers on addressing both their JD Edwards problems, but also their day to day business problems. So a typical week for me always looks like something like, oh, we've got this one UB not working, or hey, our business is trying to create this new product line or trying to do this new initiative. Do you have any idea of how we could set this up, or what's your thoughts on what's the best way of doing this in JD Edwards or just in our entire tech stack? So that's kind of what I do here at ERP Suites for our customers.
Yeah, and you're also a recurring guest on a podcast. You forgot to add that in, but you know what? I'll let it slide. I'll let it slide.
I want to be humble. This is appearance number two for me.
Heck yeah. I mean, the only person that has more is Drew Robb, but that's just because his schedule is a lot
Yeah.
easier to, go around. So
Those are some big shoes to fill. I'm not gonna lie.
that is very true. But heck, let's start here. Why should tariffs be seen as more than just a financial issue?
So, first of all, tariffs are a wild topic these days. I mean, unless you're really just staying up to date on tariff news every day, you're already behind. It's changing week by week sometimes, right? Even last week, there were some new tariff regulations that were passed or clarified. So it's an ever changing landscape. And essentially, the way that our global supply chains have worked over the last 15, 20 years is that we've all been buying stuff from overseas. We're all importing steel or parts or, molds or dyes. There's so many different things that we need for day-to-day production. We're importing it from China or Vietnam or other parts of the world. Brazil or Canada even, right? And all of these countries now have different tariff regulations that they're all applicable, they're all kind of applicable to. So it's really important because the tariff, and these are not, these are different tariffs than what we've been used to since the last 15 years or so, right? It's not like, oh, there's a 5% tariff here or a 10% tariff there, right? We're talking that in some cases for certain countries, there are 50% tariffs. That means if you're buying something for $10,000, you got to pay $5,000 in tariffs. That's half of your cost, right? These things are actually eroding your margins or eating into your margins for your product. And the thing is, not having that set up in your costing data in your system is really causing a lot of companies to have the totally wrong information about their financial outlook and their product costs inside of JD Edwards. Right. There are customers that we're working with today where the challenge they're facing is that they don't really know what the true cost of their product is. And unfortunately, that creates a really big problem because if you don't know what the true cost of your product is, you don't really know how to correctly price your product, which then at the end of the day means you're not really sure if you're making money on that. And that's really what a lot of our customers need. They need to be able to make money on these things.
Yeah, it's such a simple, basic way of looking at it. And like, yeah, you have to make money. That's what businesses are. That's what our economy is. And at the end of the day, like, yeah, just was reading something earlier today about the whole Apple situation and how they had to move in-house or they would have to pay, I think it was $600 million in tariffs yearly. And that's an insane amount. And as an Apple user, I mean, that could really change the landscape of the entirety of the phone industry, especially for US users, because that's our main source is Apple. So there's a lot of different things that really go into this, but how do tariffs directly impact like landed costs and margin? And why is that dangerous if not tracked properly? I know you talked about it a little bit, but let's go a little bit deeper.
So it's really so first of all, I think it's important to understand how in your business environment and how in your JD Edwards environment you're really tracking costs, right? So most of our customers they use something we call standard costing. And then they also use a combination of something called last in costing or weighted average costing. So depending on what cost method you'd use, there's different ways that you want to really be able to handle this, right? Now, the other part of this is how do you really account for tariffs, right? How do you is tariff something that gets added into the cost of your product? Is it something that you just book as an expense somewhere else in your accounting entries? Um, and and then you're kind of treating it as more general and administrative costs rather than product costs, right? So there's all these different nuances that you have to take into account. Um, the other aspect on this is that uh the way that the tariff has to flow through the system, right, it needs a lot of information. So you need to understand, hey, where is this product coming from, right? The country of origin really matters. And you also need to understand what's called a harmonized tariff code or the harmonized shipping code for the product, right? So when you know that, it's the combination of those two things, the country of origin as well as the harmonized tariff schedule, that really determines what tariff that customs is going to charge you when you import this item, right? The other thing that really takes into account that you also have to address and understand is what is your relationship and how you actually pay tariffs as an importer. Are you going through a freight broker, right? Or do you have a direct relationship with CBP yourself, right? Are they sending you, one-off tariff invoices because you don't have a very frequent importing schedule, or are they doing more of a monthly billing for your quarterly billing for you? Because you are a frequent importer, right? Or on the other hand, are you using a freight broker that's doing all of your importing for you? And now you have the additional costs of both the tariffs as well as the freight broker managing all of those things for you, right? So there's so many layers to this. It seems like a very simple problem, but every business is a little different and every business's supply chain is a little different. So you have to really understand the nuances of the business and the supply chain to understand how is this really impacting me, right? At the end of the day, the impact usually boils down to one thing. You're not getting some sort of cost or expense into your system recorded correctly. So you don't really have the full idea and the full picture of what your true cost and expense profile looks like inside of your books, right? I'll just use this as an example. Like, for example, if you're buying steel from Brazil right now, right, there's a 50% tariff on that. So if you're importing any steel or steel-based product inside of Brazil, or if you're doing copper from Canada, or you're doing parts, automated parts from the EU, there's all of those have different tariff rates, right? Because of the country they're coming from and the type of thing they are. Once those things get applied in, let's say you're buying something for $50 a unit or $100 a unit. Now that the tariff is really being applied to that, if you don't really have that set up in your system, it becomes really nebulous as to what your tariff exposure and your tariff liability are. It also becomes very nebulous as to what the cost of your product is, right? Because now the product that you purchase doesn't really cost $100 a unit. It actually costs 150 or 125 or $110, right? Um, and you need to bake that into your costs. For example, we have a lot of customers that do cost plus pricing. And if you don't really have the tariff taken into account for your cost, well, then your pricing is staying static. And what's actually happening, you're giving it up in margin, right? And unfortunately, the businesses that aren't being proactive about this are the ones that are going to face really strong headwinds going forward into this environment that's continuing to be a very hard to navigate environment from a tariff perspective. And the businesses who are being proactive about it, who are being very active about managing this, are the ones who are going to come out of this environment very much ahead, right? Because those
Yeah.
5, 10, 15% of margin, those margin points, that's a make or break it kind of difference.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And I know that ERP Suites, we actually have smarter analytics, and there was a podcast about it a few weeks ago now, but there is that side of tracking that is built into that. Is that something that could account for tariffs in terms of tracking? Is that even something that we've thought about yet, or is that just kind of out there in the space?
I think analytics plays a big role into this, but I'm a ERP purist, right? So at the end of the day, for me, when it comes to organizing businesses and financials, right? If it's not hitting your GL, it's not real. And I think that's the big thing with tariffs. A lot of people are just saying that, hey, yeah, we're accounting for tariffs, but where is it hitting your GL, right? Is it hitting your GL when you finally get that invoice from your freight broker? That's not good enough, right? If that's the only time your tariffs are hitting your GL, you got to pull that way upstream. If you're not pulling, if the tariff liability isn't hitting your GL when you're actually receiving your products, you're not seeing the full picture of what your how tariffs are impacting your business. And that's, I think, a really critical thing that we need to go out and teach our customers in the marketplace right now. Right. So I think analytics is one solution to this, but I think analytics is a lagging um, kind of solution, right? You want to really be on the leading side of the solution. So what you really need to be doing is you need to be making sure that there's the appropriate landed cost setup inside of JD Edwards. So if you're doing buy side tariffs, right? So if you're incurring tariffs as an importer, you need to make sure that you have the setup inside of JD Edwards that's accounting for your tariffs from your suppliers and your items when you're actually receiving those items. That's going to allow you to do two things. One, that's going to allow you to determine if you really want this to impact your cost of your product or not. And if you do, then you're going to then you get to actually see what your true cost profile and your cost picture is for that item. Right now, the cost of that item inside of your system isn't $100, it's 125, right? So all of a sudden, now all of the decisions that are made in your business based on that cost have now all been correctly impacted because they should be impacted. You should be basing decisions in your business based on those tariffs. Secondly, the other thing it's going to do is it's going to create a tariff expense accrual or liability for you, right? So now you can basically track what you might how much I owe in tariffs based on actual receipts, right? So this is not how much I owe in tariffs because a freight broker sent me an invoice and now I got to manually reconcile it. This is how much do I owe on tariffs based on my own data, based on what I actually received into my system, into my warehouses, right? And then when I do get that invoice from the freight broker, and now I do have to reconcile it, if I don't see the right, if it doesn't reconcile correctly, if it doesn't match, now I know that I have something to investigate. So you're also automating that vouchering process for your freight brokers. And that also creates more efficiencies, right? So if you aren't doing that, right, if you're not accruing for that tariff, accrual, right? Then it's going to create more manual work for you downstream. So what's going to happen is, you're going to have to manual investigate. Hey, did my freight broker invoice me for all the stuff that they were supposed to? Did they invoice me for some extra things? Did they categorize everything correctly? Versus if you are actually already doing it yourself automatically inside the system, because there's functionality to do that. When your freight broker just sends you the invoice, you just got to be like, yep, these two things match and I'm good to go. So that's an instant approval. Or, hey, there's some sort of discrepancy here, and now I actually need to spend the time to investigate, right? And that ends up becoming a much more efficient process than kind of doing it at the end. So just to really like summarize, right? Again, if you're the only time the tariffs are hitting your GL is right at the end when you get the invoice from your freight broker, you have to pull that in earlier because you're missing out on a gold mine of data that's going to allow you to make better business decisions.
100%. And not to jump to the next question this quickly, but with the shifting global trade landscape, especially the volatile changes in these tariffs, how do tariffs impact strategic decisions coming from the C suite?
So it really comes down to pricing, right? Pricing and strategic price, like really strategic pricing is really what it comes down to. So almost every one of our customers that sells a product goes through some sort of a price increase or price renewal or pricing exercise once a year, right? Some do it more frequently, but usually once a year is pretty typical. Um, Now, a lot of times when those companies are doing their pricing, they're looking at two things. They're looking at a few things, right? One's they're looking at where's the market headed that I sell into, right? Is the market headed towards growth? Is the market headed towards new products? Is the market headed towards here, right? There's still teams that are being strategic about, hey, how do I go sell to this customer? How do I go sell to that customer? And one of the big components of that is how do I price to sell to that customer, right? And if you don't really know what your cost is, right, and you're not taking the tariffs into account for that cost, then you aren't really able to use an accurate picture to base that price on, right? Now, there's the flip side of that, right, which is where if you're in sort of some sort of an agreement where you're selling goods to other countries and you have to, for example, charge them for the tariffs that they're going to have to pay, right? Or you're paying them on you're paying for those tariffs on their behalf. Then you need to do the advanced pricing setup and the correct setup to charge for that tariff. But really, when it comes to the buy side of this, if you don't really know what your products are costing and you don't know what the true cost of that is going into your production, then you're not going to be able to do correct pricing and make sure that you as an organization, as a revenue team, have the healthy margins that you really need for your business.
All right, let's get real. What makes managing tariffs in JD Edwards so challenging?
That's an interesting question, right? Because as somebody who knows JD Edwards really well, I don't think it's challenging. But I also know that, my customers probably wouldn't agree with me on that, right? To them, it's, navigating tariffs is this whole host of understanding shipping regulations and global trade regulations and weird harmonized shipping codes, which if you ever really dive into it, you're like, what the heck are these don't make sense. There's like 17 codes for the same thing, right? Like, there's 17 different codes for steel auto parts and you're stuck kind of wondering which ones to use. So those it's confusing not because the setup is confusing in JD Edwards, it's confusing because it's just a confusing, and it's a very opaque, um, environment, right? So, there's a lot of gatekeepers, I think, also to this environment, so there's a lot of people who kinda hoard that information, and if you, aren't somebody who's dealt with it before, it can really seem daunting as to how do we navigate all of the tariff environment outside of JDE and really get it to be set up inside of JDE, right? So I don't think it's the JDE configuration itself that's really that confusing. I think it's actually like the tariff regulatory environment that's confusing. And then secondly, I think the other main challenge of doing this is that tariff, especially in an ever-changing environment like this, setting up tariffs in JD Edwards just requires a lot of master data management, right? And I feel like every time I come on your podcast, I end up preaching about master data management, and that's because it's really really true. Because you do have to continuously update where your suppliers are located, where they're shipping things from, what the country of origin for parts are, what's the harmonized tariff schedule, what's the actual tariff percentage, what is this basis, right? You have to continuously keep that updated, especially in an environment that shifts, right? So, just in the last couple of weeks, we have had tariffs change for auto parts, right? We've had tariffs change for steel. So those things are things that you have to stay up to date on, right? And the hard part is a lot of our customers are struggling with just keeping day-to-day master data up to date, right? Customers, items, and addresses. Adding another layer of master data onto that, which is tariffs, it just compounds the problem, right?
No, exactly. And when you're talking about the compliance side of it or the governance side of it, it really comes down to what is the outside world doing. It doesn't specifically mean that the JD Edwards environment isn't ready for it or isn't built to accommodate for this. It's more of the outside world that is forever changing. And so you're right. When it comes to master data, and it has been an underlying thing across every single podcast that we have done, you have to clean your data. You have to make sure that you're proactive in cleaning your data. If it's for an upgrade, if it's for little applications that you want to add into your JDE environment, it all comes down to you must have clean data. Because if your clean data isn't clean to start, well, if your data in general isn't clean to start, then what are you doing? I mean, it's simple as that. I know it's comes off a little bit like, oh yeah, of course, like I should clean my data, but you have to. You have to make sure that you're proactive in that space. But when it comes to compliance, where do most JDE environments fall short, especially around like audit trails and documentation? And what are the consequences if this isn't done correctly?
I think one of the areas that I think the environments fall short is really having those cross-functional conversations across your business, right? Tariffs don't just impact um, your accountants. They don't just impact only operations. They don't just impact only sales. They impact the entire business, right? So I think where a lot of times I see people falling short is not having those kind of like those universal cross-functional conversations where you all kind of as a leadership team sit in a room and start to say like, hey, this is our strategy for how we're going to handle tariffs as a company, right? We are all getting together deciding, we're stacking hands and we're saying this is how we are going to handle this, is how tariffs, this is how we're going to record tariffs, this is how we're going to apply tariffs, and this is how we're going to make business decisions based on the impact of tariffs, right? And having those conversations is challenging, right? Because a lot of times people don't really understand how is it going to impact me, right? So sometimes we have to help facilitate that, and that's okay. We enjoy doing that. But once you really get that engine humming, you kind of get everybody on the same page or reading from the same sheet of music, you can really start to get steer the ship to understand, okay, how are we gonna deal with this tariff, right? Um, I think that's really where I see a lot of the shortcomings. Now, of course, right, making sure you have the right master data set up and making sure you have the right documentation around those items, and also making sure you have the right information from your supplier is another area that I think is really important. Look, for example, suppliers will sometimes ship where they're sourcing products from, or shift where they're sourcing products from, or they'll shift where they're making products, right? They're being impacted by this tariff environment just like you are, right? So you have to have a relationship with your suppliers to understand how are tariffs impacting their business so you can understand how it's going to impact your purchasing from them, right? Suppliers, sometimes we like to think of them as, hey, they're just suppliers. They're kind of outside. When suppliers are unique, they're really part of your ecosystem. You have to treat them as a stakeholder, right? Just like you do with your customers. Because if you're, and you have to have the respect that tariffs are impacting their environment too, right? You can't just say, hey, I'm going to totally screw over my suppliers, right? And make them give me discounts or this and that, right? I mean, there's some negotiating that has to happen there, but you also have to have the respect that, hey, the tariffs are impacting your business, they're impacting my business, they're going to impact my customer's business, right? So you also have to have those conversations at that level to say, how do we come together and find what's an amicable solution for this, where, hey, we're all mitigating the impact, but at the same time, we're all still able to run healthy businesses with healthy margins that aren't totally screwing us over, right? And a big part of that is having conversations with your suppliers where your suppliers are keeping you up to date as to where they're sourcing their products from, how they're making their products, what are they doing to get their products to you? Do they have any tariff mitigation strategies in place that they can help you with, right? Um, what's the added cost of those mitigation strategies, if any, right? So you need to have those conversations so it can keep your data up to date, right? So for example, if a supplier is shifting that they're now going to send you parts instead of sending you parts from their facility in South America, they're going to start sending you parts from their facility in Europe because that gives you a 15% tariff advantage, right? Or a 15, yeah, percentage point advantage. Um, you know, those things you're only going to be able to find those things if you're having conversations with your suppliers, right? And then using those conversations as basis points to keep that master data up to date, right? We're going to keep coming back to that, unfortunately. The other thing that's going to be important there is making sure that your suppliers are finding those tariff mitigation strategies, right? Do they have intermediaries then they can use? Do they have sister companies or partners or subsidiaries they can use to kind of help you avoid and mitigate those tariffs? Um, and lastly, right, with kind of challenges and shortcomings that we'll sometimes see is that customers aren't having conversations with their customers on how this is going to impact them, right? Is this going to impact pricing? Is this going to be something that we need to upcharge you for? And how do we upcharge you for that? Is it something that we're going to just bake into your pricing going forward, right? Well, customers may not be happy about that because they may be thinking, hey, what if there's new regulation that comes out that changes my pricing or changes the tariff, right? So sometimes customers may want to see tariffs as a separate line item on their charge. They may want to see a upcharge, right, instead of a baked in higher cost of the item. So there are those things that we have to also account for that are only going to come from talking to your customers, right? And there's ways you can do setup in the system to handle that as well. Like, you can use advanced pricing or use like free goods or add-on items or anything like that to do that. But it all starts with having those conversations with both your stakeholders, right, suppliers and customers, and really understanding, hey, across the whole business environment, how are tariffs impacting us? How are they impacting you? And how are we all going to handle this?
Yeah, exactly. And if a company really doesn't do this, they could be facing something like fines, like if they're not paying the right amount, or if there's a shady way that they're doing it where they're trying to route it through a different country to get like their supplies there for a cheaper cost. There are different ways that you could see fines. And in that way, it's going to impact your business more than it impacts your supplier, your customers in that way. But there's also the side of maybe there's delays because, yes, you're right. Maybe they're actually going to be selling it to you from Europe, or they have a different plant that's out there that, or supply, whatever you want to call it, warehouse that's out there that will be shipping to you. Maybe those parts are going to take a little bit longer than something from Central America or something like that. And in that way, you can still see those delays and these consequences that we've been like that you you've been talking about, we've been talking about. It's one of those things that can really impact your business. It can impact your customers' trust. It can impact your suppliers' trust with you. And it can even impact your brand. Because if you're not trustworthy, if you're not forthcoming, and exactly what you said, the transparency side of it, if you're not transparent with your customers and your suppliers, you are going to lose trust. And that relationship will eventually fizzle to whatever will end up fizzling to. Not saying that you're going to lose business, but it's something that could happen. But now that we've outlined the challenge, yeah, sorry, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I think you brought up a really good point, right? Like how we haven't even started talking about how this is going to impact your supply chain in general, right? So far, we're really just talking a lot about how it impacts your financials and your costing, but there's also the real world impact of how is this going to impact your actual receiving and your transportation of goods, right? If you're, for example, having to route things to a different country or you're having to route things from a different supplier, that's going to have real impacts in your supply chain, and that could cause potential delays. It could cause shipment issues. It could cause bad customer experiences. You're totally right that there is a impact to the brand here that also has to be taken into account. And I don't think it's something that is really, it's not considered because you have to outweigh the cost versus benefit of, hey, is it worth it for me to take on this impact, like take an extra couple of weeks to get this product and delay some orders, or do I just have to kind of suck it up as a business, pay the tariff in order to be able to fulfill and meet a customer demand, right? So those are some very important strategic decisions that you have to make and face. Yeah.
Now that we've outlined the challenges, let's talk about how companies can respond. On the buying side, that means thinking through both immediate workarounds and longer term strategies for configuring JD Edwards effectively. Could you give us a little bit of a rundown of what a short term stopgap, like common thing that you have seen companies respond with the tariffs?
So on the buying side, I think it's really important to first make sure, from a master data perspective, that's another master data reference right there. You have both the country of origin as well as the harmonized tariff code for the item accurately kind of logged somewhere inside the system. And the other side is to make sure you have the correct landed cost rules and landed cost setup inside the system. I think that's really critical, and that you have the landed cost set up done in a way where you've decided how is it going to impact the product cost of that item, right? The '07 or the '08 cost of your item, right? Or the '02 cost of your item. Um, so you want to make sure you have all those. And the other thing is you also want to make sure that as a business you have the correct kind of decision made on how do you want to handle the accounting of the tariffs, right? Are you going to have the tariffs being booked to a specific account? How are you going to have the tariffs logged inside your GL? Right? Are you gonna do, are you gonna have debits to inventory and credits to AP trade and tariff accrual, right? And then how that's going to get all booked out, right? And then the last thing you want to make sure is that what is my tariff true up or my tariff reconciliation process, right? So when I actually get my freight bill from my freight broker who's bringing and paying for those tariffs and then charging me for them, how do I compare that against what I've accrued from a tariff perspective and make sure that it reconciles and that evens out, right? So I think that is that's kind of the main four pronged or four step short term solution you have to do. Long term, I think it's really important to make sure you build a almost like import center of excellence or a supply chain center of excellence that's keeping up to date on these things, that's maintaining these things, that's also ensuring that you have the right, data setup and data management policies around these things, right? So those things are staying up to date. So that's kind of the short term and the long term on the buy side. And if you need help doing that, that's something we can help you with. But to be honest, the landed cost setup is not very complicated. It's very easy. There's a really great implementation guide out there that I think walks through it. And if anything else, if all else fails, I think ChatGPT does a great job of walking you through how to implement this.
Good old ChatGPT shout out. We did a review episode with Drew Rob last or a few weeks ago at this point, but it really does dive deep into open source versus true JD Edwards environment native digital assistants. Now, let's flip the script. If you're a supplier, tariffs can affect pricing strategy, obviously. That's what we've been talking about. In the short term, though, is absorbing cost really sustainable? And what are the risks that really go into that?
I think that's a really great question, and it's a very strategic question, and it's going to matter and differ based on what environment you're in. And unfortunately, it's going to really matter depending on what industry you're in. If you're in automotive or steel or any sort of rare earth mineral or metal manufacturing right now, where you're doing any sort of metals based manufacturing, industrial metals manufacturing. You might as well bite the bullet and do this in your costs. It does not seem likely that the regulatory environment is going to change. We are going to have protectionist policies going forward in these typical industries. So, at that point, businesses have to make the real decision of, hey, do we incur the tariff cost of continuing to stay with overseas suppliers? Do we start doing a sourcing exercise and start looking for local domestic suppliers and deal with sort of the price discrepancies that are going to come with that, right? And that's a very strategic decision. It's going to be very depending on industry, depending on relationships, depending on supplier sourcing networks, right? So that's something where if you've got a chief purchaser, or chief purchasing officer, or chief procurement officer, or if you've got a strategic sourcing department, you need to be, proactively talking about those and talking with them on, hey, how are we responding to these tariffs and how does that need to be set up and impacted inside the system, right? Um, and these are it's a hard question to answer because it's really, really dependent. There are some industries where it is going to make sense just to bite the bullet and do the setup. And then there's going to be other industries where it's going to stay such a shifting dynamic environment that you're better off not incorporating it into your costs and instead accruing for the expense elsewhere outside, so you can still see the expense of the tariff, right? So you can still see your detailed tariff expense associated to the products that it's associated to, and still account for the actual reconciliation for it, but you don't have to actually incur it inside of your product cost. You can kind of do it outside of your product cost, right? And same thing on the sell side, right? Where you can either now incorporate this into product cost and change your actual pricing based on this, or you can kind of do this as add-ons or surcharges. And both of those have strategic reasons, right? And I'm not saying a company will even have to do all or one, right? All or none, right? It's not that you have to do this. You may have to get to the point where you're tactical about this at a product supplier level, right? Or a customer product level. Now, for some customers and some products, you're going to just take it right into the cost. And for some customers and some products, you're going to really add it on as a surcharge. And this is where I really advise businesses lately on this is that, you know, the businesses that are going to come out of this tariff environment with the highest outcomes of success and the highest likelihoods of success are the ones that are going to not die by 1,000 paper cuts, right? It's really those 2-3% margin points that you're giving up on each transaction that's really going to kill you at the end, right? You wanna make sure that you're saving yourself. Like, right now, we're in this tactical battle of 1 margin basis point at a time, right? We gotta do 100 basis points at a time for margin. We gotta fight for every little bit you can, and that's why it's so important to have those strong networks of relationships between suppliers and customers, because that's where that comes in, right? This is not the environment where home runs are going to win it, right? It's a singles and doubles game right now, and you're going to have to figure out how do I eke out those 2, 3, 4, 5% of margin points that I can keep that I can get out of my items, right? So it's going to get very tactical. It's very very detailed. And I think the companies that are going to roll up their sleeves and get their hands dirty with it and really get tactical with it are the ones that are going to come out of this at the other end with the most success.
Exactly, and there's really so much that goes into it, but I will shout out my man Nico Horner because that's really the game that we're trying to play right now. He's not a home run hitter at all, but he's hitting about 300. It's all about singles and doubles. He has a terrible slugging percentage. He's mostly just a singles guy, but it's the short term. You have to figure it out, like, because of how easy and how much the tariffs landscape is truly changing right now. It's so fluid that, yeah, you could have a plan today, but that plan could completely shift by the end of the week or even tomorrow. And that's okay. You have to be fluid with a lot of this stuff right now, as long as you're having that transparency with your customers, with the buyer side, with the supplier side, any side you look at it. Transparency is a good thing in this exact situation. But for the long term, do you see companies shifting towards an automated price updates, or are they going to have to renegotiate terms with customers?
I think everything's on the table right now, right? This is an environment where this is not an environment that a lot of us have lived through before, and it's new for me a lot of times too, right? So creativity and ingenuity really comes, I think, plays a big part here, and that's the problem with that is that, in these kind of dynamic environments, it's hard to think long term because everything is so shifting, right? Um, but I think long term, the thing that's gonna really make it or break it is going to be that relationship factor. It's also going to be the factor of, do I have the really understanding of my system and how all of these things flow through my system and my data? Um, right? And that's gonna also be a very big differentiator, right? So if you're not already familiar with how do you handle landed cost setup and how do you handle advanced pricing setup and how do I use orchestrations to do some of these things, if you're not familiar with that, you're already behind, right? So the first step in order for you to have that long-term success is to be dynamic about this. And in order for you to be dynamic about this, you have to build expertise in those areas and then know how to use them strategically to guide your business through this, right?
If tariffs are keeping your leadership team up at night, you're not alone, and you don't have to go it alone. The ERP Suites team has deep experience helping JD Edwards users configure smarter, faster tariff visibility and strategy. To connect with Mo or learn more or any of our other team, visit erpsuites.com today. But that's a wrap on today's episode of Not Your Grandpa's JD Edwards. Massive shout out to you, Mo. I know reoccurring guest for unpacking this complex but crucial topic. If this sparked ideas for your own JDE setup, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with your ops or finance teams or anyone that you would think would find this beneficial. But until next time, keep asking the right questions and stay ahead of change. Thank you.